There's something strangely comforting about Morrigan from the very first moments. Not comforting in a safe way, but in the way a well-built nightmare feels deliberate. You can tell immediately that this film looks far more expensive than you'd expect, and it knows exactly how to use that advantage. From the rugged Irish landscapes to the worn stone structures and suffocating cave systems, Morrigan commits fully to selling its world. And that commitment matters. Before we begin, would you please support me? Subscribing is free and very important to me. Please subscribe for better analysis and more videos. Directed by Colm Eastwood, Morrigan taps directly into Gaelic mythology with a sincerity that carries the film even when parts of the execution stumble. You can feel that this story wants to respect the folklore it's pulling from, and that respect goes a long way in grounding what could have easily turned into a generic possession movie. The story follows an archaeologist specializing in Gaelic myth who travels to a remote region of Ireland with his teenage daughter. What begins as a routine academic excavation slowly transforms into something far more dangerous. The discovery they make doesn't just uncover history, it unleashes it. At the center of this nightmare is an ancient pagan war goddess, freed from confinement and very much uninterested in staying dormant. From that moment on, the film shifts gears into a survival story. While this setup will feel familiar to fans of the genre, Eastwood avoids relying on cheap jump scares or over-explained lore. Instead, he lets location and atmosphere do most of the work. And when Morrigan leans into atmosphere, it's at its strongest. Visually, the film is often striking. The caves feel ancient, lived in, and genuinely hostile. The production design does a lot of heavy lifting long before anything supernatural fully reveals itself. There's an ever-present sense that the environment alone could kill you, and that tension never really lets up. The cave diving and tight space sequences are especially effective. They tap into a very primal fear of being trapped underground, surrounded by darkness, stone, and silence. When the film slows down and allows those moments to breathe, it becomes deeply unsettling. These scenes don't rush. They let discomfort build, and if you find yourself holding your breath during them, that's exactly the point. The cast is solid overall, though the performances aren't entirely consistent across the board. That said, there is a clear standout. Emily Flynn is the undeniable anchor of the film. Her performance balances teenage rebellion with something far more sinister once possession begins to take hold. She doesn't play the transformation as exaggerated or theatrical. Instead, it feels gradual, uncomfortable, and deeply wrong. Her physical presence changes in subtle but effective ways, and every moment she's on screen adds to the film's sense of unease. When she's not speaking, the movie feels quieter. When she is, the tension spikes. The Morrigan herself is handled with restraint, which turns out to be one of the film's smarter choices. The entity is kept mostly in the shadows, appearing just enough to remind you of its power without exhausting its impact. When the goddess does fully manifest, the effect lands precisely because the film hasn't overused her presence. There's also a clear appreciation for practical effects here, and it shows. Body transformation moments are surprisingly well executed, and the exorcism sequences, while not revolutionary, are grounded and effective. The film understands that horror works best when it feels tangible. When you can almost feel the weight of what's happening, it sticks with you longer. Unfortunately, not every effect shares that understanding. The CGI is inconsistent, and while much of it is serviceable, there are moments where it actively undermines the immersion. The most noticeable issue comes with the snakes. When they appear, the illusion collapses. The effects feel outdated and distractingly artificial, pulling you out of the experience at exactly the wrong moment. It's not something you can easily ignore, and it clashes sharply with the otherwise grounded aesthetic. Narratively, Morrigan starts strong, but loses some momentum in its third act. The film lingers just long enough that you begin wondering how everything is going to wrap up. While the emotional resolution itself is fairly satisfying, the final twist feels more confusing than clever. It introduces new questions without fully earning them, leaving several threads unresolved. Some viewers may appreciate that ambiguity, others may find it frustrating. Still, even with those issues, the film largely succeeds at what it sets out to do. Morrigan doesn't reinvent pagan horror, but it understands why the genre works. It relies on place, myth, and atmosphere rather than non-stop spectacle. Its strongest moments come from silence, darkness, and the sense that something ancient and indifferent is watching. And that feeling lingers. What ultimately makes Morrigan worth watching is how much it respects its setting and source material. The landscapes feel like characters themselves. The mythology isn't treated as a gimmick, and at the heart of it all is a genuinely unsettling presence that gives the story weight. If you're someone who enjoys folklore-driven horror, films that prioritize mood over noise, and stories where the environment is just as dangerous as the monster, this is a film that deserves your time. It may stumble in places, but it never feels careless. And sometimes that sincerity is enough to carry a horror film further than flawless execution ever could. If you're still here with me, you already know this isn't a movie that wants to scare you quickly. It wants to sit under your skin and stay there. Until next time, keep an eye on the shadows, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.